Legolas. Legolas is the elf most people know first, and that familiarity does him a quiet disservice. He is a Sindar Elf, a grey elf, the son of Thranduil, the king of the Woodland Realm in northern Mirkwood. He is a prince, though he rarely speaks of it, and he joined the Fellowship of the Ring as the representative of all Elvenkind in the great quest to destroy the One Ring. In terms of raw, world-shaping power, Legolas sits at the bottom of this list, and it is important to understand why that is not an insult. He belongs to a younger age of the world. He never saw the light of the Two Trees. He never fought in the great wars of the First Age when elves dueled Balrogs and wounded Dark Lords. He is a warrior of the Third Age, a time when the elves had already begun to fade, and the truly cataclysmic powers of the world had mostly passed out of it. Measured against a Legolas, he is extraordinary. Measured against a Fëanor, he is a candle beside a bonfire. But what Legolas is, he is almost perfectly. He is arguably the finest archer in the entire War of the Ring. His eyesight is inhumanly sharp. He can see riders across leagues of open plain, count them, and read the devices on their shields when a mortal man would see only a smudge on the horizon. His reflexes and his aim are so precise that in the great battles he cuts down enemies faster than anyone around him can follow. At Helm's Deep and on the Pelennor fields, he is a one-elf slaughter, felling orcs and Uruk-hai in numbers that turn the fight around him. And there is the other, subtler quality of the elves that Legolas carries. He does not tire the way mortals tire. He can run for days across hard country without rest or food, his feet barely marking the snow, moving with a lightness that his mortal companions cannot match. He does not feel the cold as they do. His senses reach into a world they can barely perceive. Legolas represents something important on this list. He is the baseline of elven greatness. He is what an ordinary, unlegendary elf looks like when he is simply very good at what he does. And even that baseline is enough to make him one of the deadliest members of the Fellowship. He is the floor. Everyone above him is a story about how much higher that ceiling goes. Elrond is one of the most important figures in the entire history of Middle-earth, and yet his power is easy to underestimate because he so rarely uses it as a weapon. He is half-elven by birth, the son of Rivendell and Elving, descended from the greatest bloodlines of both elves and men. When the choice of the half-elven was given to him, the choice of whether to live as an elf or as a mortal, Elrond chose the elves. And so, he became one of the wisest and longest-lived lords in Middle-earth, the Master of Rivendell, a keeper of memory across thousands of years. Elrond's strength is not the strength of the battlefield, though he has seen more battlefields than almost anyone alive. He fought in the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, when elves and men marched together against Sauron and threw down the Dark Lord's tower. He stood before the slopes of Mount Doom, when the One Ring was cut from Sauron's hand. He remembers, with his own eyes, events that to everyone else in the Third Age are ancient legend. When Elrond speaks of the past, he is not reciting history. He is a witness. But the true measure of Elrond's power is the ring he bears. He is one of the three keepers of the elven rings of power, and his is Vilya, the Ring of Air, the mightiest of the three. Understand what that means. The elven rings were not corrupted by Sauron. They were forged to preserve, to heal, to hold back the decay of time. With Vilya, Elrond maintains Rivendell as a refuge, a place of safety and healing and quiet strength that has stood untouched through an age of war while kingdoms fell all around it. His command over water is part of this. When the Nazgûl pursue Frodo to the very border of Rivendell, it is Elrond's power, working through the river, that rises up in a flood and sweeps the ring wraiths away. And Elrond is a healer of extraordinary skill, perhaps the greatest healer left in Middle-earth. When Frodo is stabbed on Weathertop by the Witch King's cursed blade, a wound that would have turned him into a wraith, it is Elrond who draws the shard of the Morgul knife from his shoulder and pulls him back from the edge of the Shadow World. That is not a small thing. That is a power to reverse the work of the most feared servant of the Dark Lord. Elrond is strength as preservation. He is the still point around which the free peoples gather, the founder of the council that decides the fate of the ring, the keeper of a light that refuses to go out. In a world that is fading, he is the one holding the line, Gil-galad. Gil-galad is a name that carries weight even among elves, and part of his mystique is how little of his full story survives. He was the last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth, the final great sovereign of the elves, who returned from Valinor to wage war against the Dark. For most of the Second Age, an age that lasted more than 3,000 years. He was the supreme lord of the elves east of the sea, the one they looked to, the one they followed into war. The kingship passed to him after the fall of the earlier High Kings, and once it settled on him, he held it longer and more steadily than any elf king before, all the way to the very end of the age. And his power was formidable. Gil-galad ruled during the age when Sauron first rose to open dominance, when the rings of power were forged and the Dark Lord revealed himself. When Sauron's armies overran the elven lands, it was Gil-galad who held the line in the north, who kept the west from falling, who preserved the strength of the elves through their darkest century of that age. He wielded a great spear named Eglos, Snowpoint, and it is said that none could stand against it. In an age of the world when the elves were still mighty, he was the mightiest king they had. His greatest and final act was the War of the Last Alliance. At the end of the Second Age, Gil-galad joined with Elendil, the king of the men of Númenor in exile, and together they forged the greatest host the world had seen since the wars against Morgoth. They marched on Mordor. They besieged the Dark Tower for 7 years, and at the very end, on the slopes of Mount Doom, Gil-galad and Elendil faced Sauron himself, the Dark Lord in his own physical form, at the height of his power. Think about what that required. To stand before Sauron, not a lieutenant, not a shadow, but the enemy himself, wielding all his strength and malice, and to close with him in single combat. Gil-galad and Elendil brought Sauron down, but it cost them everything. Both kings were slain in the struggle. Gil-galad, the tales say, was destroyed by the sheer heat of Sauron's hand, burned in the grappling. The last High King of the Noldor died throwing down the greatest evil of his age, and with him, the line of the High Kings ended forever. No elf would ever again hold that title in Middle-earth. Gil-galad is strength as sacrifice at the highest level. He was a king who spent 3,000 years holding back the dark, and who in the end gave his own life to buy the world its greatest victory over Sauron before the very end. Celebrimbor is not on this list because he was a warrior. He is on it because his power was of a different and rarer kind, the power of the hand and the mind, the power to make. He was the grandson of Fëanor, the greatest craftsman who ever lived, and Celebrimbor inherited that gift. He was the finest smith of the Second Age, and in the whole history of the elves, only his own grandfather stood above him in skill. Understand what elvencraft actually is in this world. It is not simple metalwork. The greatest elven smiths could pour something of their own spirit and will into the things they made, could forge objects of true power, artifacts that shaped the fate of the world. Celebrimbor was the master of this. In the peaceful years of the Second Age, in the elven realm of Eregion, he led the greatest smiths of his people in the making of the Rings of Power, and the 3 greatest of those rings, the 3 elven rings, Nenya, Narya, and Vilya, the rings of water, fire, and air, the very rings that Galadriel, Gandalf, and Elrond would later wield, were forged by Celebrimbor's own hands alone. That is the scale of his craft. The rings that preserved Lothlorien and Rivendell for an entire age, the rings that held back the decay of the world, that kindled hope in the hearts of the free peoples, were the work of this one elf. There has never been a greater ring maker among the elves, and there never will be. His power, though, became his tragedy, and it is worth understanding because it reveals the limits of even the greatest making. Sauron came to Eregion in a fair and friendly form, disguised, calling himself a giver of gifts, and offered his knowledge in the great work. And Celebrimbor, trusting, learning, poured his genius into the craft alongside him, never knowing who he truly was. It was only when Sauron secretly forged the One Ring to rule all the others that Celebrimbor understood, far too late, what his own skill had helped to create. But here is the measure of the elf. When Sauron revealed himself and made war on Eregion, Celebrimbor did not break. He hid the 3 elven rings so that Sauron could never touch them, and when Sauron captured him and tortured him without mercy to learn where they were hidden, Celebrimbor endured it and did not yield the 3. He died under torment, protecting the greatest works of his own hands. Celebrimbor is strength as creation, and as the refusal to let creation be corrupted, even at the cost of his own life. Thingol is one of the oldest and most singular elves in the entire history of the world, and his strength is bound up in his sheer antiquity. He is one of the most ancient elves of all, one who awoke among the firstborn at Cuivienen in the earliest days and became a leader of his people, so ancient that he saw Middle-earth in the ages before the sun and moon even existed, when the world was lit only by the stars. He is a Sindar king, though in truth he is greater than that title suggests, and he ruled the vast hidden kingdom of Doriath in Beleriand for thousands of years. What sets Thingol apart, what makes him so much more powerful than an ordinary gray elf, is what happened to him before Doriath was ever built. In the earliest days, on the journey toward Valinor, Thingol met Melian, and Melian was not an elf. She was a Maya, one of the angelic spirits who existed before the world, a being of the same order as Gandalf, Sauron, and the Balrogs. Thingol and Melian fell in love, and they became husband and wife, the only union of a Maya and an elf in all the history of Middle-earth. That union changed him. Being bound to a Maya, dwelling in her presence across the ages, Thingol was lifted beyond the measure of other elves. He grew in stature and in power, and Melian herself wove a great protection around his kingdom, an enchantment called the Girdle of Melian, an invisible wall of power that surrounded all of Doriath and made it impossible for any hostile creature to enter without her leave. For thousands of years, while war raged across Beleriand, while Morgoth's armies burned the world outside, Doriath stood untouched behind that girdle. It was one of the safest places in the entire First Age, and its safety was a direct expression of the power gathered around its king. Thingol was tall beyond the measure of men and elves alike, mighty in arms, and he held his kingdom through the most dangerous age the world has ever known. His fall, when it came not from an army, but from the same flaw that ruined so many great figures, desire for a treasure. He was slain by dwarves in a quarrel over a silmaril and the necklace that held it, killed within his own halls. But for the length of his reign, Thingol was among the mightiest elves ever to hold a crown, an ancient king lifted up by the love of an angelic being, ruling a kingdom no enemy could enter. Lúthien is the daughter of Thingol and Melian, and she is one of the most extraordinary beings ever to exist in Tolkien's world, because she is neither fully elf nor fully anything else. She is the child of a gray elf king and a Maya, an angelic spirit, and she inherited the power of both. She is the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar who ever lived, and she was also, in a way that almost no one expects from her gentle reputation, one of the most powerful. Lúthien's strength is not the strength of the sword. It is the strength of song and enchantment, inherited from her mother, and in her it reached a level that no other elf ever matched. Her power was in her voice, in the raw magic of Maya blood expressed through elven song, and with it she accomplished things that armies could not. Consider what she actually did, because it is staggering. When her beloved Baron was captured and thrown into the dungeons of Sauron himself, in the fortress of the Isle of Werewolves, Lúthien went to rescue him, and on the way she came face to face with Sauron, the Dark Lord's greatest lieutenant, a Maya of immense power in his own right. She did not flee. Aided by Huan, the great immortal wolfhound of Valinor, she met Sauron in a contest of song and power, and she overthrew him. She cast down the tower and forced him to yield, one of the very few beings in the entire history of the world to break Sauron in a direct confrontation of will. Let that settle. An elf maiden broke the power of Sauron and took his fortress from him, and that was not the end of it. To fulfill the impossible quest her father had set, the recovery of a Silmaril from Morgoth's own Iron Crown, Lúthien walked into Angband, the deepest stronghold of the first and greatest Dark Lord, a place from which no enemy had ever returned. She stood before Morgoth himself, the mightiest being that ever entered the world, seated on his throne surrounded by all the terror of his power, and she sang. Her song was so powerful that it cast the entire court of Morgoth, and Morgoth himself, into sleep. The greatest evil the world has ever known was laid low, unconscious, by the voice of a single elf. In that moment, Beren cut a Silmaril from the Dark Lord's crown. No other elf ever did what Lúthien did. She overthrew Sauron, and she put Morgoth to sleep. And when Beren died, she did something no elf had ever done. She died of grief and followed his spirit, and then stood before Mandos, the keeper of the dead, and sang a song so sorrowful and so beautiful that she moved the very powers of the world to pity, and won back both their lives. Lúthien is strength as enchantment carried to its absolute limit, a power that unmade the works of Dark Lords, with nothing but a voice. Glorfindel is one of the most fascinating figures on this list, because he is an elf who died, and came back, and returned to Middle-earth more powerful than before. He first appears in the First Age as a Lord of Gondolin, the great hidden elven city, one of its noblest and most valiant warriors, golden-haired and mighty. And it is in the fall of Gondolin that Glorfindel earned his eternal fame. When Gondolin was betrayed and fell in fire and slaughter, Glorfindel led the fleeing survivors, including a young child who would become one of the most important figures in all the history of the world, through the mountains to safety. And in a high pass, they were ambushed by a Balrog, a demon of the Elder World, a corrupted Maya spirit of fire and shadow, one of the most terrifying and powerful creatures ever to walk Middle-earth. The kind of being that, in a later age, Gandalf himself could only defeat at the cost of his own life. Glorfindel faced it alone to protect the people behind him, and he killed it. In a duel on a mountain peak, this single elf lord fought a Balrog and cast it down into the abyss. But as it fell, it dragged him with it, and Glorfindel died in the act of slaying it. He gave his life to buy the survivors their escape, and among those survivors was the child who would grow up to sail to the Undying Lands and change the fate of the world. Killing a Balrog in single combat is one of the rarest feats in all of Middle-earth's history. Only a handful of beings ever managed it. Glorfindel is one of them, but his story does not end with his death, and this is what makes him so extraordinary. For his valor and his sacrifice, Glorfindel was returned to life in the Undying Lands, re-embodied by the powers of the world, and he dwelt among them for an age, growing in spirit and in might. And then, when the shadow rose again in Middle-earth, he was sent back, one of the very few elves ever to return from death and cross the sea again, now a being of vastly greater power than he had been before. The Glorfindel who appears in the Third Age, who rides out to rescue Frodo from the Nazgul and drives the ring wraiths into the flood at the border of Rivendell, is not an ordinary elf lord. He walks in both worlds at once, the seen and the unseen. To the ring wraiths in their shadow realm, he appears as a figure of blazing white light, and they cannot stand against him. Glorfindel is strength as valor rewarded and doubled, an elf who slew a Balrog, died, returned from the dead, and came back mightier than any elf who never left. Galadriel is the greatest of the elves still living in Middle-earth during the War of the Ring, and among the most powerful elves ever to exist. She is of the Noldor, the high elves who dwelt in Valinor and saw the light of the two trees with their own eyes before those trees were destroyed. That light changed her, as it changed all who saw it. It is part of why she is so much greater than the elves of the later ages, who were born into a dimmer world. She is one of the last living elves who remembers Valinor in its glory, one of the last who carries that ancient, undimmed light in her spirit. She was there at the very beginning of the great tragedies. She was among the Noldor who left Valinor and returned to Middle-earth in the First Age, and she has lived through every age of the world since, watching kingdoms rise and fall, outliving nearly everyone she has ever known. By the Third Age, she is ancient almost beyond comprehension, one of the eldest and wisest beings left in Middle-earth, the Lady of Lothlorien, ruler of one of the last great elven realms. Her power is real, and it is vast. She is the bearer of Nenya, the Ring of Water, one of the 3 elven rings of power. With it, she preserves Lothlorien as a realm out of time, a place where the decay of the world does not reach, where the golden trees never lose their leaves, and the ancient light of a better age still lingers. It is a living echo of Valinor kept alive by the strength of her will. She is said to be the mightiest and fairest of all the elves remaining in Middle-earth, greater in raw power than Elrond, greater than any elf lord of her age. Even Sauron feared her, and he could not pierce the protection she wove over her land. But the truest measure of Galadriel's strength is a moment when she does not use her power at all. When Frodo, in Lothlorien, offers her the One Ring freely, she is tested as few beings ever are. And in that moment she sees what she could become. She describes it herself, a queen not dark, but beautiful and terrible as the dawn, treacherous as the sea, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All would love her in despair. She could take the ring and overthrow Sauron and set herself up in his place, a power greater than the Dark Lord had ever been. And it is within her reach. The ring is right there, and she refuses it. She passes the test, and in doing so, she chooses to diminish, to remain Galadriel, and to accept that with the destruction of the ring, her own power and her realm will fade and pass away. That is the real strength. Not the power to seize the world, but the wisdom and will to refuse it when it is offered freely into her open hand. Galadriel is strength as ancient light and mastered will, the greatest elf of her age, who was strong enough to say no to becoming a god. Fingolfin. Fingolfin is the High King of the Noldor, and his place on this list is earned by a single act so audacious, so magnificent, that it stands alone in the entire history of Middle-earth. He was one of the great lords of the Noldor who returned from Valinor, a mighty warrior and a king, and he led his people through unimaginable hardship across the grinding ice of the far north into Middle-earth to make war on Morgoth. For centuries, he held his realm against the Dark Lord, one of the strongest kings the elves ever produced. But it is the manner of his death that made him immortal in legend. There came a catastrophic battle in which Morgoth's forces broke the long siege of his fortress and swept across the north in fire, shattering the elven kingdoms, burning the land, slaughtering the free peoples. And Fingolfin, watching his people fall, watching the ruin of everything the Noldor had fought for, was overcome with a wrath and a despair so total that he did something no one else in the history of the world ever dared. He rode alone to the gates of Angband, the fortress of Morgoth himself, the greatest and most powerful being ever to enter the world, a fallen god. And he challenged the Dark Lord to single combat. Understand the scale of this. Morgoth was not a monster to be fought. He was one of the Valar, the godlike powers who shaped the world at its making, the mightiest of them all. To challenge Morgoth was like a mortal challenging a mountain, like an insect challenging a storm. And Morgoth did not want to come. He knew the risk. He was the only one of the Valar who ever knew fear, and he feared this. But he could not refuse the challenge before all his host without disgrace. And so he came, towering, terrible, wielding a great black mace called Grond, the hammer of the underworld. And Fingolfin fought him, alone. This one elf, shining with a light like the Valar themselves in his fury, dueled the Dark Lord of the world. 7 times Morgoth struck at him with that world-shattering hammer, and 7 times Fingolfin leapt aside and stayed on his feet. And 7 times Fingolfin wounded Morgoth with his sword, drew the black blood of a god, and made the mightiest being in existence cry out in pain. No one else ever wounded Morgoth in open battle. No one. Fingolfin did it 7 times. In the end, the elf grew weary and stumbled, and Morgoth crushed him. But even in dying, Fingolfin drove his sword into the Dark Lord's foot, and the black blood gushed out, and Morgoth was left with a limp and with wounds that never healed for the rest of the world's existence. A single elf king marked the greatest evil that ever lived with pain he would carry forever. Fingolfin is strength as defiance beyond reason, the elf who challenged a god to single combat and made him bleed. Fëanor. And so we come to Fëanor, and there is no serious argument to be had. He is the mightiest elf who ever lived. Not the mightiest of his age, not one of the great, the greatest, full stop. In the whole history of the children of Iluvatar, across every age of the world, no elf ever came close to matching the sheer, blazing intensity of Fëanor's spirit. He is the peak. Everyone else on this list is measured against the space beneath him. Fëanor was the eldest son of Finwë, the first High King of the Noldor, and his mother was Miriel, who poured so much of her own spirit into bearing him that she was left utterly spent and chose to lay down her life afterward, unheard of for an immortal elf. That is the first sign of what Fëanor was. He took so much fire into himself at birth that his own mother was emptied by it. His name means spirit of fire, and it was not a metaphor. He burned hotter than any being of his kind ever had. His gifts were beyond measure. He was the greatest craftsman, the greatest smith, the greatest maker in all the history of the elves, greater even than his own grandson Celebrimbor. He created things no one else could have imagined. He made the Palantiri, the seeing stones. He devised a written script that the elves used ever after. His mind moved faster and reached further than any mind among his people. And then he made his masterpiece, the thing that no craftsman before or since could ever equal or reproduce, the 3 Silmarils. The Silmarils were jewels, but calling them jewels is like calling the sun a lamp. Into them, Fëanor captured the actual living light of the 2 trees of Valinor, the pure, holy, unmarred light of the world, before it was darkened. That light could never be made again, and Fëanor caught it and held it inside 3 gems of his own devising, a feat of creation so great that even the Valar, the powers of the world, marveled at it. When the 2 trees were later destroyed by Morgoth and Ungoliant, those 3 jewels held the only remaining pure light of the elder days in all of existence. Fëanor had made the most precious objects that ever were. But Fëanor's power was not only in his craft. His spirit was so strong that it burned within his body like a furnace, and his will was nearly unbreakable. When he spoke, his words could move an entire people to follow him into rebellion, into exile, into war. His oath, the terrible oath he swore with his 7 sons to pursue anyone who kept a Silmaril from them, became a curse that devoured his whole house across 3 ages of the world. A binding so powerful, it held the souls of his descendants past death itself. That is the strength of the will behind it. And in the end, that same fire consumed him. When Morgoth stole the Silmarils and murdered his father, Fëanor's rage was so total that he led the Noldor out of Valinor in open rebellion against the Valar and returned to Middle-earth to make war on the Dark Lord himself. He was the first to reach Middle-earth, and he flung himself at Morgoth's armies with such fury that he outran his own host. He was ambushed by Balrogs, surrounded, and even then he fought on, wounded again and again, refusing to fall. It took multiple Balrogs to bring down a single elf, and even mortally wounded, his spirit burned so fiercely that when he finally died, his body dissolved into ash and flame, consumed by the fire of his own spirit leaving the world. That is Fëanor. So mighty that his death drained his mother, so brilliant that he captured the light of the world in 3 stones, so willful that he defied the gods themselves, so fierce that his spirit burned his own body to ash when it departed. No other elf ever matched him. No other elf ever will. He is the strongest of all the children of Ilúvatar, the spirit of fire, the peak that all other elven